What does it feel like when the very hand of God, the hand you once reached for in prayer, seems to turn against you with the weight of a crushing mountain? Have you ever looked into the mirror and failed to recognize the person staring back, not because of age, but because of the hollowed-out shadows of a soul that has been scoured by grief? Most people know the story of Ruth, the loyal daughter-in-law, but we often overlook the woman who stood at the center of the storm, the woman who left her home as a queen of her community and returned as a ghost of her former self. Today, we are going deeper than the Sunday school version of a widow's journey. We are going to uncover a hidden prophetic mystery buried within Naomi's sorrow, a revelation that connects her darkest hour to the lineage of the Messiah in a way that will change how you view your own suffering. If you feel like your life is a series of closed doors and empty cupboards, stay with us until the very end. Because Naomi's transformation holds a secret about the emptiness of God that most preachers are afraid to touch. The air in Bethlehem was once thick with the scent of baking barley and the rhythmic thrum of harvest songs, but by the time Elimelech looked out over his parched fields, the atmosphere had shifted into a suffocating shroud of dust. Imagine the cracked earth of the house of bread, the literal meaning of Bethlehem becoming a place of starvation. The irony was a physical weight. Naomi would have felt the grit of the Judean wilderness in her teeth, watching her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, grow thin, their ribs beginning to trace lines against their skin like the very ridges of the starving hills. The cultural pressure was immense. To stay was to risk watching her family wither, but to leave was to abandon the inheritance of the covenant. They chose to flee. They crossed the Jordan, leaving behind the promised land for the purple-misted mountains of Moab, a land with a dark history and strange gods. You can almost feel the heat of the sun on Naomi's neck as she walked away from her heritage, her heart hammering with a mixture of survivalist desperation and a nagging sense of spiritual betrayal. In Moab, the tragedy did not strike like a single lightning bolt, but like a slow rising tide that eventually drowned everything she loved. First, it was Elimelech. The man who was her covering, her strength, and her identity in a patriarchal world was suddenly gone, leaving her a widow in a foreign land. Can you feel the isolation of a woman whose only anchors were two growing boys in a culture that viewed her as an outsider? She watched her sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, perhaps hoping that new life would sprout from the ashes of her old life. But then, the silence grew even heavier. 10 years of waiting for grandchildren who never came, followed by the unimaginable, the death of both her sons. The text of Ruth 1-5 records it with a chilling brevity. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, and the woman was left of her two sons and her husband. In the ancient world, a woman without a male protector was not just grieving, she was economically and socially extinct. Naomi was a living eulogy, a woman whose name meant pleasant, but whose reality had become a jagged shard of glass. The internal conflict Naomi faced was a war against her own identity. She wasn't just mad at the world, she was convinced that the Almighty had set his sights on her destruction. When she heard that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread, she didn't celebrate. She calculated the cost of a humble return. The journey back to Bethlehem was a march of the broken. Picture the three women on the dusty road, the elder Naomi stopping to urge her daughters-in-law to turn back. "Turn again, my daughters, why will ye go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands?" Ruth 1:11. Her voice would have been raspy, with the dry winds of the desert and the salt of a decade of tears. She was practicing a form of holy pessimism, trying to protect them from her own perceived curse. She saw herself as a carrier of misfortune, a woman so hollowed out by God that she had nothing left to offer but the warning of her own tragedy. As they crested the final hill and the stone walls of Bethlehem came into view, the stir in the city was electric. The women of the town gathered, whispering, squinting through the sunlight at the haggard figure approaching. "Is this Naomi?" they asked. The question wasn't just one of recognition, it was one of shock. How could the radiant woman who left a decade ago return looking like a shadow cast by a dying fire? Naomi's response remains one of the most haunting moments in all of Scripture. "Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me." I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Ruth 1:22-1. This was not a polite, I'm doing okay for the sake of social grace. This was raw, unadulterated spiritual honesty. She was accusing the sovereign of the universe of stripping her bare. She was a woman who had reached the 0 point of human existence, where even her name felt like a lie. But here is where the cinematic lens slows down, focusing on the small, seemingly insignificant details that the casual reader misses. Naomi thought she was empty, but she was standing next to Ruth, the more than 7 sons blessing she couldn't yet see. The climax of this story isn't found in a grand miracle or a voice from a whirlwind, but in the mundane scraping of grain in a field. Naomi, recovered from her initial paralysis of grief, begins to move with a quiet, calculated wisdom. She instructs Ruth on how to approach Boaz, the kinsman redeemer. Wash thyself therefore, and anoint thee, and put thy raiment upon thee, and get thee down to the floor. Ruth 3:3. This wasn't just matchmaking. This was Naomi engaging in a high-stakes spiritual gamble for the restoration of her family line. She was moving from a victim of fate to a strategist of grace. She watched from the shadows as the legalities of the city gate unfolded, waiting to see if the emptiness she lamented would be filled by the very God she thought had abandoned her. The shocking revelation that most sermons ignore is the prophetic architecture of Naomi's bitterness. We often focus on Ruth's loyalty, but consider this. Naomi is a corporate mirror of the nation of Israel and a foreshadowing of the bride of Christ. Just as Naomi left the land and returned empty to find a redeemer, Israel has often wandered in the Moab of the world, only to find that their restoration comes through a kinsman who is willing to pay the price. But more importantly, look at the genealogy. When Ruth and Boaz have a son, the women of the town do something strange. They don't say, "A son is born to Ruth." They cry out, "There is a son born to Naomi." Ruth 4:17. This child, Obed, was the grandfather of David and the ancestor of Jesus Christ. The emptiness Naomi complained about wasn't a vacuum, it was a clearing. God had to empty her of her own self-sufficiency, her own family security, and even her own name, so that he could fill her with a lineage that would save the entire world. Her bitterness was the soil in which the root of Jesse was planted. The lessons carved into the stones of Naomi's life are profound and piercing. First, we must understand that your Mara season, your season of bitterness, is not the final chapter of your biography. Naomi believed her story was over when she stood at the gates of Bethlehem, but God was actually just beginning the prologue of the greatest story ever told. Are you judging the quality of your life based on a middle chapter? We often mistake the pruning for the killing. Naomi felt the blade and assumed she was being destroyed, not realizing she was being prepared for a fruitfulness that would outlast her own life by thousands of years. When you feel empty, ask yourself, is God removing the clutter of my old life to make room for a glory I cannot yet conceive? Emptiness in the hands of God is a prerequisite for a new filling. Furthermore, Naomi's journey teaches us about the necessity of spiritual honesty. She didn't hide her pain behind a mask of religious platitudes. She told the people, "The Lord hath testified against me. There is a deep, therapeutic power in laying your grief before the community and before God without sugarcoating it." God did not strike Naomi down for her honesty. He answered her bitterness with a grandson who would bring her, "Restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age." Ruth 4:15. Your pain is not a barrier to God's grace. It is the very place where His grace wants to meet you. Have you been trying to fake your way through a trial? Or have you been brave enough to admit that you feel empty? Restoration begins the moment we stop pretending we are full. Finally, consider the power of the secondary role. Naomi was not the one who married Boaz. She was the one who mentored the woman who did. Often, our greatest contribution to the kingdom of God isn't our own success, but our willingness to guide someone else into theirs. Naomi took the child Obed and laid him in her bosom and became nurse unto it. Ruth 4:16. The woman who wanted to be called bitter ended her life as a nurse of kings. Your greatest legacy might not be the house you build or the career you forge, but the spiritual life you nurture in the next generation. Naomi's arms, which were once folded in grief over the graves of her sons, were now opened to hold the future of the messianic line. As we look at the life of Naomi, we see a woman who moved from the house of bread to the fields of Moab and back again, proving that no matter how far you wander or how much you lose, the path of return is always paved with mercy. If you are standing today where Naomi stood looking at the ruins of what used to be, feeling like the Almighty has dealt bitterly with you, take heart. The son born to Naomi reminds us that God is a master of the reversal. He takes the widow and makes her a matriarch. He takes the famine and makes it a feast. He takes the bitterness of Mara and turns it into the sweetness of the gospel. Your story is not over. The emptiness you feel is just the space God is using to write a new, more glorious beginning. I want to thank you for walking through this dusty, tear-stained, yet ultimately triumphant journey of Naomi with me. It is my prayer that you see your own struggles through the lens of this divine perspective. If this story touched your heart or gave you a new sense of hope, I invite you to join our community. Please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button to help others find this message, and share this video with someone who might be in their Mara season right now. I would love to hear from you in the comments. What part of Naomi's story resonated most with you? Are you in a season of waiting? Or have you seen God turn your bitterness into a blessing? Let's talk about it below. May the God of Naomi, the God who fills the empty and restores the broken, be with you today and always. See you in the next story.